Hello, it's an honor and pleasure to be here with you, with my co-author Abigail Perez back there, and our principal investigator, Shell. She's running the show here. As it was stated, the title of our topic is Techno Utopias and the Ecocidal and Genocidal Tendencies of the Euro-Scene. That's what we call it, because we come from an indigenous perspective and a capitalist scene. So first, I want to acknowledge that we are on the stolen and unceded land of the Ohlone indigenous people. This is not often enough acknowledged. And we see to this day the establishment of a type of civilization that completely altered the intimate relationship that indigenous peoples held with this land. For example, land management based on managed forest fires, a kind of project that today is being revived by the indigenous people in the eastern Klamath region just north of here around Humboldt. So we need to acknowledge that this is indigenous land with which indigenous peoples had an intimate relationship that was fairly sustainable over the course of millennia. So our talk will counterpose two different kinds of dystopias and utopias. On the one hand, I'll talk about the late modernist liberal utopia of how the Anthropocene is interpreted and how we ought to respond to it. And then I'll talk about how indigenous, decolonial, and ecological feminist perspectives, my co-author will talk about a lot of that, are responding to the question of the Anthropocene and the kinds of dystopias and utopias that are being accounted for from those subaltern perspectives. So in the mainstream liberal Western perspective, it's all of a sudden a realization that we're living in some sort of ecological catastrophe, that there's an impending doom that's coming upon us in this time where man has finally attained the mastery and conquest of nature, and at the same time is bringing upon himself, and in this case the gendered aspect is important, a catastrophe that was not previously there, and that is obviously, as was articulated by Tom, if I may call you this, very good prelude. It's articulated as a catastrophe that's impending, that's happening, that's going to get worse, right? But it's not, it's relatively a recent acknowledgement. And clearly the scientific evidence for this kind of impending catastrophe is unavoidable. Breaching of planetary boundaries, how many of us are familiar with the breaching of planetary boundaries? We're basically altering the Earth system past the point where effects of destabilization may be irreversible in terms of climate change, but also in terms of many other Earth system parameters like biogeochemical flows. And for me, the collapse of biodiversity, the fact that the dominant capitalist Eurocentric patriarchal civilization is driving the sixth mass extinction, right? And the recent report by the World Meteorological Organization, which attests to what was already said, it's really accelerating to a point where it's clearly visible. Hurricanes, forest fires, all these kinds of effects, right? So this is obviously a catastrophe and it's unfolding, right? And I will refer to the exact same paper because this is a major paper. A short paper that articulates what is likely to become the dominant scientific liberal interpretation of where we are. It has a lot of strengths, but it also brings up a number of controversial points. The diagnosis is, in terms of Earth system science, pretty point on. What it endorses in terms of course of action is up for a number of controversies. The first thing that you find in the paper is a very detailed and concise interpretation of tipping points, cascade effects, shifting into a hothouse Earth where we've altered atmospheric conditions beyond the Holocene stability that enabled the rise of civilizations, and we're entering a point of absolute unpredictability where, oh, sorry about that. These things are just amazingly difficult.
It's cool.
All right, here we go. I'm not going to do that. Okay. So we're moving into a point of a hothouse Earth where the relatively unique stability of the Holocene, which is not a normal state of the Earth system, but a very unique history, epochal history in geology, is being altered beyond repair, right? And so the paper very interestingly lays out the tipping points, the irreversible effects, the feedback loops, everything else. And I really strongly suggest you read it. Now, what it endorses in terms of action is up for controversy. In light of the emergency in which we find ourselves, the authors start articulating, Will Steffen, if you know, Johan Rockström, the A-list, the notion that humanity can deliberately steer and manage the Earth system through different kinds of interventions and human actions into a stabilized Earth system that is under 2 degrees centigrade of warming, okay? That we can implement certain actions through a sort of management, and these terms are used within the text. Steering, managing, and what's actually the most interesting term, a human stewardship of the entire Earth system, okay? And the kinds of actions that they endorse are, include things like reducing and prompting deep cuts in greenhouse emissions, not controversial, at least in statement. Protecting, enhancing, or creating biospheric carbon sinks, including the creation of new types of carbon sinks. Efforts for carbon dioxide removal from the atmosphere. Modifying the Earth's energy balance, including contemplating solar radiation management. And of course, adapting to the unavoidable impacts of the Earth system disruption. Right? For anyone who's deeply involved in discussions about the types of actions that we ought to take in light of this emergency, we know that some of these proposals open the door and perhaps endorse some actions we call geoengineering. Okay? Particularly the notion of carbon dioxide removal, as has been illustrated within the recent IPCC report that was referred here. The recent IPCC report includes this 4th pathways for climate change mitigation. All of these pathways, especially P2, P3, P4, assume that we may have limited or large overshoot of our carbon budget. All of the pathways already include the assumption that we will implement a strategy called afforestation. And for those of you know how many of you have heard the term afforestation or afforestation? Different from reforestation. Afforestation includes the creation of forests where they did not previously exist. As this is factored into the dominant capitalist system, this is largely going to be used as an excuse for the plantation of large monocultures of fast-growing carbon-absorbing tree plantations. The sort of what's called bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. The creation of large monocrop plantations of trees that will rapidly absorb carbon, and then those trees can be cut down, burnt in an incinerator to produce energy. The CO2 captured from that energy can then be stored underground in deposits from which there may spill, or that CO2 can then be marketed by the fossil fuel companies for enhanced oil recovery. You know, you can pump liquid CO2 into depleted wells to extract the remaining oil. So the companies that are at the forefront of carbon capture and storage are in fact the same companies that are producing climate change. Some of the companies that are at the forefront of experimenting with these kinds of strategies are in fact companies that are the producers of the problem. So it's not to say that the authors endorse this pathway, but certainly to say that when the IPCC starts considering afforestation in all of its pathways, when the IPCC starts considering bioenergy with carbon capture, use, and storage, then we're at the point where the argument is going that we're in a state of emergency. We're going to overdraft. We're going to go past the limit of emissions. We'll have no choice but to start implementing these emergency interventions that will lead us into a sort of management of the entire Earth system as a whole. Right? It's a little... So this is what we call a sort of a sleepwalking into an epistemology of mastery, sort of the utopia of late modernity. The idea that we can actually achieve a managed stabilization of the Earth through the implementation of certain techno-scientific interventions, like bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. While we're not there yet, and the IPCC warns about this, it's increasingly acknowledging that it may be necessary. And the sort of interest groups that are involved in pressuring for these kinds of methods are more and more influential. And we have to warn that this is becoming more accepted. The indigenous perspective is very different from this. We're not in a new catastrophe. We have been in a catastrophe for the last 500 years. Indigenous peoples have faced genocide, dispossession, depopulation rates, the stolen land, all the catastrophes that we now associated with upcoming climate change. Indigenous peoples have been facing those catastrophes for 500 years. The crisis didn't start with the culmination of the Anthropocene. The crisis for indigenous population has been an ongoing crisis. And indigenous peoples hold specific knowledge that can allow us to adapt to a new kind of situation. So I'm going to skip here so that we can get to, So it has been argued that the remaining 80% of the world's biodiversity is held within the 20% of territory that is still controlled by indigenous peoples. If we have any biodiversity left in the planet, it's because indigenous peoples have fought to preserve that biodiversity. 1/3 of the carbon stored, the terrestrial carbon sinks in forests held by indigenous peoples. So when we're talking about transition alternatives, what we ought to be looking for is not this managerial techniques of bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, or solar radiation manager, or this attempt to control nature as a whole, but instead to give land back to the indigenous peoples who had developed an intimate relationship with the land for thousands of years. And the process of colonization, which dispossessed indigenous peoples, which led to the exploitation of the land in favor of capital accumulation, was the main driving force of the Anthropocene. So decolonization is part and parcel of the process of a just transition. So in that, with that point, I want to shift to my co-author, and I'm going to kind of also move.
Hi everybody, my name is Abigail. So I just want to start with this citation from Berta Cáceres, that she was killed. I prompt you, it's not the topic of this presentation, prompt you to look at the causes of her killing, and also the intellectual perpetrators of her killing are closer to us than we think. So let's start. It says, "Let us wake up, humankind. We are out of time. We must shake our conscience free from the rapacious capitalism, racism, and patriarchy that will only assure our own self-destruction." So this part of the presentation is on ecofeminism, and you can see the cover from the one of the books that represent these perspectives, and some of the books are right there. This is a quote that I want to read for you from Val Plumgood. Is, "We live in a world increasingly like the feminist dystopias, where technological mastery extinguishes both nature and less technological rational cultures, where we face the imminent prospect of loss of the world's forest along with its species diversity and human cultural diversity, where already many cultures have had the basis of ancient survival patterns destroyed by a species of development and progress, which produces inequality, pollution, and waste, and where the dominance of rational man threatens to produce the most irrational of results." And this is very important here, what Leonardo has been saying, "the extinction of our species along with many others. Ecological feminism tells us that it's no accident that the world is dominated by men, and we must select the specific type of men dominating the world." And as I already mentioned, the control of mastery of nature, echoing ecofeminists like Plumgood and Marchand, and the making of the human as an inheritance on imposition of settler colonialism and coloniality are reflected in the creation of solutions to climate change based on an assumed possibility to avoid a sense of false grief, or eco-grief, as some people have coined, what has been lost due to a supposed malfunction of the created system. For this reason, it is assumed that a fix is possible, and infinite creation of exits are desirable to save what has been created under modernist pretenses. These apparent and false glitches to the system within the capitalist heteropatriarchal system, echoing Lugones, is what the Techno Utopian solutions represent. So we're going to see how ecofeminism is trying not only to explain the mastery of nature, but also trying to find the solutions to these techno fixes that they're trying just to like band-aid covers to the heteropatriarchal capitalist system. So, and this is a concept that I guess you have widely aware of, the concept of cheap nature and the embodiment of capitalism. Cheap nature is at the core of capitalism, audacious and peculiar combination of productivism and exterminism. These two works are in double register. One is cheap nature as economic process. In this, cheap natures comprise those necessary elements of capitalist reproduction, above all labor, food, energy, and raw materials. In this movement, cheap nature embodies a logic of cheapening and in ethico-political sense, relocating many at times of the majority of humans into nature, the better to render the work unpaid, devalue, invisibilize early primitive accumulations, epochal achievement, went far beyond the expulsion of direct producers from the land, eternal equality and the expulsion of women, indigenous peoples, Africans, and many others from humanity. So in this sense, we're going to see how cheap nature is going to become an embodiment, as Michael James Garcia is mentioning, how the physicality matter of race and gender in the context of the Anthropocene, Euro-Capitalocene, recenters the question of justice and liberatory or abolitionist practices to an interactionism that transgresses the human-animal divide. This interactionism is between humans and the more than human worlds. It has its roots in ecofeminist perspectives as well as indigenous cosmologies / pluriverses. So then we're going to find how epistemologies of mastery is what is at stake. Here is a sort of utopia that is the guiding light for the dominant social and economic system and the frame of life and thought that produce it. This utopia culminates precisely in the total mastery of nature and takes the shape here of the total mastery of Mother Earth in an epochal and teleological narrative that endorses the patriarchal and anthropocentric stewardship, steering and management of the entire Earth system, primarily at the hands of those social groups and societies with the most capabilities to influence its trajectory. On the other side, you can see on white, it says, the strain of Western thought separating humanity from nature has been traced back as far as the emergence of Christianity, but it's widely accepted that Enlightenment rationality and the Industrial Revolution greatly accelerated the tendency. Francis Bacon notoriously prompted the idea that nature secrets can be extracted from her bosom through technologies that will enable the dominant nature order. No longer viewed as a nurturing mother, nature was conceived as an inanimate machine existing to serve human needs and transformed from teacher to a slave. In this case, we're going to see how the pluriverses, coming from indigenous cosmologies, are one of the most attractive alternatives, if not the most sustainable and liberatory-oriented practice, an alternative. As Miller points out, the politics of indigenous knowledge within environmental discourses is not a simple defending rights to territories or benefits. Instead, it is tied to competing visions of communal environmental inhabitation and land-based environmental ethics in relation to conserving the genetic and cultural diversity, infrastructures of agroecological and integrated ecosystems, common in practices. In this, more than one world is at stake. What is needed is the nurturing of pluriverses, multiple worlds of rich biocultural diversity. And now, Leo. And I think that's all for us. Thank you.
Okay.